make sure that he mostly served God first, and then also was able to work in very different government systems.
You're really
sure that
you got it really right. Is because we're talking about thousands of years ago, where there's no such thing as religious liberty or peaceful transition of power, or although there are civilizations, but it's not like now. There's no separation between church and state. Mostly the kingdoms that Daniel was in were monarchs. They were kings. So basically, when they say something good, that's good, but if there's something against you, then you are basically done.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like there's no such thing as a fair trial. In that, when we look at that story of Lions, then I think we'll eventually get there. There's no like, okay, what, like there's Supreme Court. No, I mean, there's nothing like that. There's no appeal. So you are basically your own, that you may face some situations where literally, I think that comes Daniel chapter 3, when King Nebuchadnezzar asked everyone to bow down to the golden statue. And, there's nothing. There's no space to argue against it, but they were faithful. So, Mark, you're right. It's just wonderful example that we can find from the scripture.
I feel like we as Christians should be able to operate in any government as long as we put God first, and as long as that line is never crossed, we should be able to work peacefully.
Yeah. And another thing is that he was recognized by those state leaders. Like in the first chapter, we're gonna see that right away today. They recognized that Daniel was smart and he was faithful, he was royal, and he's someone that they can trust, and even his wisdom was 10 times better than others, where the king thought that he could entrust this business of running the government with him, who was captured. So yeah, incredible witness of God, definitely in there. So shall we? I know we have several people who are joining here on Zoom. I assume some of them are watching from YouTube or Facebook live streaming. But we're gonna start right now. If you have your Bible, let's go to Book of Daniel, chapter 1. Book of Daniel, chapter 1. And I have New King James Version. I don't know what version you have, but that's just fine. You can read whatever version you have. Most likely phones have different versions. Or still, I assume you have several different translations in front of you.
I have my 4.
Very good.
It's a parallel Bible.
Oh yeah.
That's really awesome. So can we begin with, let's begin with Stu. Would you be willing to read verses from 1 through 2? Let's just go through 2 verses first. Okay.
Okay. And this is a New American Standard Bible version. And in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasury of his God.
All right. Well, welcome, Laverne. It's good to see you.
Good to be here.
Yeah. So we just read first 2 verses, and any thought as you read this? I know it kind of looks like historical background of that. Anything came out? Any impressions you have? So,
So-
like, yeah.
So Nebuchadnezzar comes and besieges the city,
Mhm.
but only gets some of the articles of the house of God. Don't you take over and take everything?
I mean, we can see more down there, or more details here. What was going on? That he obviously, and if we look into the history, Babylon came to Judah, the kingdom of Judah, not once. They came like 3 times, and
Mm.
this was the last one. I mean, second one or last one, something like that. It was BC 605, where like what I wanted to point out was if we read First King and Second Kings, First Chronicles and Second Chronicles, God warned them.
Right.
If you know, like God warned them, like if don't do that, if you keep pushing that way, that evil way, eventually you will face this destruction. And if we were to, look closely, more details of the prophecy, by Isaiah, we are fascinated. And Jeremiah, for example, they prophesy that eventually Jerusalem will be destroyed and you guys will be taken to Babylon as a captivity, and Jerusalem will be like totally destroyed. And but eventually God will take you guys back to Jerusalem. We see that prophecy already. So it was a kind of fulfillment of one of the prophecies that he had, that they will come. And I think that you point out something very important. Like I think it was very specific where Bible, like Daniel mentioned that King Nebuchadnezzar and his troops came to Jerusalem, not only destroying the city, but they took all these articles from the house of God, the temple that Solomon built.
Mhm.
And you remember when Solomon built the temple, when he consecrated, dedicated that building to God. What do you guys remember? What happened when he did that?
God's presence came in.
Yeah, exactly. Like God's presence came down to that temple and filled his glory in that, and everyone was like just feel awe, like wow, God is here with us. And having this picture of King of Babylon, it's not just any other kingdom, but King of Babylon, or the troops of Babylon, like Babel that was mentioned in Book of Genesis. Like they are not on God's side. They represent the other side, the opposite side of God. And they came and they took not only people, but took the articles in the house of God to uh, where did he take that? He carried into the land of Shinar, the house of. It's not like he put it in a storage somewhere. Where did he put that? The articles.
Into a house of his God.
God,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, it's basically what they were thinking is like our God is stronger than your God. You see that? Like the Babylonians are saying, yeah, you have your temple, your God is there. You know what? We came and we took everything from your God's temple. We're taking it from you. Basically, this the beginning of the book of Daniel. It shows this great controversy picture. The ultimate God and ultimate, opposite of God had this conflict, and it looks like in the beginning that God has failed. It looks like Daniel's God, or the God of Israel, God of Judah, wasn't there to protect them. It looks like a failure of what was really happening. That's the kind of setting that it sets. Does it make sense?
Yeah, I just one maybe a question or comment would be, if I'm not mistaken, I think in Ellen White, in Prophets and
Kings, prophets, and kings.
Prophets and Kings, right? Okay, where she's indicating that the priests were able to, so maybe addressing a little bit of your question, Mark, priests were able to take the Ark of the Covenant and some of the articles of the temple and move them to a safe hiding place prior to this capture.
Yep, that's right. I remember that now.
I remember reading that too.
Yeah.
Yeah. So like, because in the history, if you go back to the Old Testament stories, especially, like even Samuel's time, the Ark of the Covenant, the Ark, it has that significant meaning for Israelites when it comes to the presence of God. And, when the way David, care about this Ark, remember, like he was dancing when that came into Jerusalem, they loved it. That's something very, very precious. And I think that the priests who are faithful, who are listening to the warnings of the prophets, and who saw the signs here and there, I think, maybe they were inspired, wanted to take care of that, and didn't really want to see the Ark will be the hands of Babylonian troops. And it wasn't mentioned here. It wasn't mentioned here. I think it was taken by Babylonian troop. I think it's definitely mentioned here and listed as they came and took the articles and also the Ark of the Covenant were taken, but it wasn't mentioned here. So
Right.
That's a good point. That's a good. And historically, a lot of people try to figure that out. Like, where did they hide that Ark? And we also had the famous Indiana Jones movies came out, some kind of relating to that. But we're not really limiting God's presence into one Ark. That's more than that. And that the rest of the story is basically, I don't want to spoil this kind of. It's gonna be fun, I think, as we read the way God works, because it looks like His temple is destroyed, the city of Jerusalem is destroyed, but God is still actively engaging with His faithful people in the enemy territory per se. So let's move on. Mark, can you read verses from 3 through 7? Let's just go 3 through 7.
Sure. Then the king instructed Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel and some of the king's descendants and some of the nobles, young men in whom there was no blemish, but good-looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge and quick to understand, who had ability to serve in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the language and literature of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed for them a daily provision of the king's delicacies and of the wine which he drank, and 3 years of training for them, so that at the end of that time they might serve before the king. Now from among those of the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. To them, the chief of the eunuchs gave names. He gave Daniel the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah Shadrach, to Mishael Meshach, and Azariah Abednego.
Now we have those characters. I love those. My sons, they love the stories. So like, what are your thoughts as we went through these 4 verses here? What stood out for you?
It brings back actually fond memories of when I was growing up, because my dad would always say at night, he'd always say, Shadrach, Meshach, and to bed we go now. To bed we go. So it's just a fond memory when I read those. It makes me think of my dad.
That's good. That's really good. Maybe I should use that tonight.
Yeah, sure.
that name change. What do you think about that name change?
They didn't want them to be, they wanted to take away some of their personality by giving them a
Identity.
different name.
Yeah.
I've always been a little bit, I don't know, amused. Maybe that's not the right word. I find it odd that we still to this day refer to them as the names that were given to them by the Chaldeans and not to the names that they actually were.
Right.
We have adopted the names given to them from the pagan society.
So we should always call them the Hebrew names. Hananiah.
I don't. I'm not saying that.
Azariah.
Maybe we do it just because. Well, I'm looking at forward here, and they're actually still using their Hebrew names even later in this chapter. So it does seem that we're just doing it maybe because we think it's easier to say or rolls off the tongue a little better. I don't know, but I still find it. I don't know. They might be a little sad about that when they hear about it later.
To me, just sound itself, their Babylonian names are kind of fun to call. It's just me, Meshach, and Shadrach, and Abednego. It sounds fun, but I mean that's the thing. I looked up the meaning of the names, and I just want to give you the meaning of
Oh, I like this kind of stuff. Way to go, Pastor Sean.
So Daniel, does anyone know the meaning of his name?
If I've heard it, I don't know it.
Dan L.
Yeah, you got this too. Dan is judge in Hebrew. When you have a Dani, what's an I sound, is my judge, and L is God. So you kind of provide the kind of improvised meaning there. God is my judge, or the God of judgment. That could be the proper meaning of his name. It's the same as Elijah. You remember the
Right.
Elijah? So So when it calls Eli, when Jesus said Eli, Eli, or Eli, Eli, that means my God. Like El is God, I is my. So my God, Jah or Yahweh is that name, Yah. So Elijah means like Yahweh is my God is Yahweh. It kind of goes either ways. So Daniel, that's how I read it in my language, his name. It's similar to Hebrew, which means God is my judge, or my God is judgment. It's like that. His Babylonian name.
Yeah,
Where
that's
is that? Belshazzar. Do you guys see that here?
Yeah.
Yep.
Where is that?
Number 7, verse 7.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. I found it somewhere. Oh yeah, here we go. I almost lost it. Belshazzar means the keeper of the hidden treasures of Bel. So Bel is their god. So their names were given. Their identity has been kind of changed. So the Daniel's name was, basically about God, and now he bears the name of Babylonian god.
Mm-hmm.
You see that? And who's the next one?
Hananiah.
Hananiah, the Hebrew name Hananiah, it means, it seems like Stu knows. Hananiah means the Lord is gracious to me. His name talks about grace. His name, grace to me. And what was his Hebrew name here? Hananiah.
Shadrach.
Shadrach means inspiration of the sun. Inspiration of the sun. And of course, sun is And it's basically it means like a sun god who shines graciously on you. That's the kind of meaning. It's not like your God is gracious. Is the sun god who graciously pour down the sunlight. Mishael, it means one who is like God. It sounds very familiar. I mean, similar to Michael. Michael, and that literally means who, one who is like God. Who is like God is the meaning of the name Michael, and this time here, I mean, it's very similar name in Hebrew name. The one is like God, and his name became Meshach, meaning the servant of the goddess of Sheba. The servant of the goddess of Sheba. So like a lot of theological names that they have, some kind of divine, I don't know.
I don't know. The more you're going through these, the more I'm thinking we got to go back to their other names.
I
Yeah.
agree with you, Mark.
Yes,
I think I'd be a little offended if I had gotten some of their names.
exactly.
And let me just finish one more name, and then I share my thought with you. Would that be okay?
Yes.
The last one is his name was Azariah, right?
Yep.
Mhm.
Where is that? Azariah. It means the Lord is my helper. The Lord is my helper. His Babylonian name, Abednego, that means the servant of the god Nebo. So there must be a god called Nebo there. So Abednego literally means like you are Nebo God's servant. So yeah, they change all their names like that. And to me, what was interesting is I think we will go through those stories in the book of Daniel. This Daniel and his friends, whenever they were in the like for example, the fiery furnace, they didn't bow down. Daniel wasn't there, but his three friends, they didn't bow down to the golden statue, and they were thrown into the fiery furnace. And I believe that King Nebuchadnezzar called their Babylonian name, right? Babylonian name there to them. It's a kind of, I don't know, maybe Daniel wanted to make this writing a little interesting, is because the King Nebuchadnezzar is calling these guys names in Babylonian terms, which represent Babylonian gods, but they are not very useless
Mhm.
in the presence of God. I don't know. That could be an intention by the author, but when we call them, certainly I want to take consideration of Mark's recommendation. Like we should call them with their Hebrew names. I totally agree with that.
Nobody would know who we were talking about then.
That's true. Mhm.
Should we take vote?
I don't know, voting's kind of bad today.
Oh yeah. Oh, I kind of forgot about that, and then I'm like, oh yeah, that's what
Exactly.
happened.
We're in, yes.
Sorry.
That's okay. That's okay. But anyways, changing the names, of course, that definitely is a kind of way that I think this shares the light to the entire book of Daniel, where it's in this great controversy, looking to more spiritual aspect of it, in a great controversy perspective, where Satan is not just trying to make us to do certain actions. He wants to change our identity.
Mhm.
But no matter how hard he tried, I mean, just think about that. You are young, somewhere in a young adult age, I guess, and we live in this country of freedom. But just think about you being in a country where there's an invasion and your enemy take you to their territory. You have to learn their language, their culture. somehow they were gracious enough to make you alive, but they were saying, you're going to study in the university here, and you will be representing us to be a ruler to your people in the future. So they offer you things like that, and all of a sudden giving you there's a one thing that we want to call you in a different name, and try to kind of brainwash you in a way where, I mean, I didn't experience that, but in the history of my country, we had that experience. Like when Japan occupied South Korea or Korean Peninsula, that's what they did exactly. They took all this elite, families, they took them and said, you know what, we will give you free educational experience in Japan. Why don't you guys come here? So they took them, all the sons of high government officials, they took them and they required them to study in Japan. And while they were there, they required them to change their names in the Japanese names. And then when they finished their education, they sent them back to Korea saying that, you know what, these guys will rule, but according to what we want, not according to what you want. And that's exactly what they did for 36 years, where the policy that they implemented was they changed everyone's name, not just one, everyone's name into Japanese name. They kind of banned using Korean names, Korean language, to rule over Korean people. So I kind of see that, people have done it many times. I don't know how it, worked in other places, but for God's people, when you keep your identity rooted into God, that doesn't really change. So we're gonna go into that, and the first example is right here. Vav, can you read verses from, let's just read verses from 8 through 17.
Okay. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now God had brought Daniel into favor and tender love with the prince of the eunuchs. And the prince of the eunuchs said unto Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who hath anointed your meat and your drink. For why should he see your faces worse than the children which are of your sort? Then shall ye make me endanger my head to the king. Then said Daniel to Melchizar, whom the prince of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, prove thy servants, I beseech thee, 10 days, and let them give us pulse to eat and water to drink. Then let our countenances be looked upon before thee, and the countenance of the children that eat of the portion of the king's meat, as thou seest, deal with thy servants. So he consented to them in this matter and proved them 10 days. And at the end of 10 days, their countenances appeared fairer and fatter in flesh than all the children which did eat the portion of the king's meat. Thus Melzar took away the portion of their meat and the wine which they should drink, and gave them pulse. As for these 4 children, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams.
Mm. What was the first challenge here?
I like that first statement there in verse 8, that Daniel purposed in his heart. It feels like that battle was already won by purposing it first in his heart and setting forth his path.
The purpose, or some Bible said determined.
Mhm.
I think this is really, like I said, like Daniel being a young man in an enemy territory, and him being in the, I don't want to call it that way, but he's basically testing his faith. Does it make sense?
Put in
Testing it.
perspective, could we say he's 14, 16, 18 years old?
It's hard to tell like the age wise, but he must have been like late teens or early 20s somewhere. That's
Right. over the
that's
years.
the guess that we have. But still, you are in the. I mean, it's not like these days,
Right.
and I don't know. I think it takes a lot of courage, the deep conviction and courage to stand where you are in a situation like that.
But God always also blessed him with a
Mhm.
friendship, which gave him, I'm going to say, an easier time,
Mm-hmm.
with the people over him, that he might maybe witness to them. Gave him that opportunity by becoming in good standing with them.
A few years ago in Oshkosh, actually, they had this play on Daniel, and they try to do it's kind of musical on this story. And I can send you the link. It's really well done musical.
Yeah.
And they try to kind of explain to the audience about how Daniel and his friends should have done that. Like they're not manipulating. They try to show the sincere conviction of their heart. But at the same time, they needed to have some kind of wisdom to kind of juggle it through. Does it make sense? Like they're in the palace. It looks very nice. Everything is formal. Making official requests, like that's what they did here. Like official request. The response was like, no, I'm not gonna do that because my life, I can't be this. What kind of struggles that he must have had in that particular situation in order to be faithful to God. And certainly he needed that wisdom, of course, courage, but he needed that wisdom, not just the end of the test, but he needed to have that wisdom to navigate through these challenges in the palace. And I don't know. I mean, it's just amazing for me to even think about that. Like normally when you ask something, the official letter comes down saying no, then you always think that, oh, it's not gonna work that way. But he's kind of kept pushing that to the point where he can be faithful to God. And
It
I
will
think that's a
be-
huge.
Oh.
Go ahead, Mark.
It will be very interesting to find out what those 3 years of training and learning were like for them. How much of a precedent did this set for how they would act throughout the next 3 years? Or is this just one example of many struggles that they had to stand up for during that time? I don't know. We're told here, or the assumption here is that they're training for 3 years time. So I guess that would be interesting to kind of learn about that someday.
Which strikes me, Mark, that this has got to be day one. We eat.
Certainly early on.
Yes, it appears that they didn't violate the command or the requirement to eat the king's meat or whatever
Right.
prior to this. So it's either day one or they were fasting or something occurred, but it's very, very early in that 3-year period of time.
And even to me is like, even here's the thing, like I explained this at the beginning. Now the city that they were in is called Jerusalem. The temple they were in was built by Solomon. And this, um, I don't want to even go to theologically speaking. I just want to say as a, one person, that his life and his people and their identity have been rooted into their city and their temple, and now it's gone. Like in front of them, it's gone. Like, and they never thought that it's possible for the enemy of God can come and destroy the temple and the city. And they could see like all this military, the soldiers went into the temple and grabbed this precious utensils and articles from there and they took it to their temple. And that must have been very traumatic situation where they thought like, we're safe, God is with us, we're safe because God anointed this city. It's like today, like everyone thought that the capital is always always safe place. I've been to DC many times,
Mhm.
and I always see police officers, they're security guards, and we know there's so many different kinds of surveillance videos, cameras are there. I never thought that place can be safe like that today. But when that happened, like it just had some impact in our heart, in our mind, like, wow, how can that be happening? So Daniel and his friend must have been very shocked, even from the moment when the city and the temple was destroyed. And now next is they're taken as a captives, going to Babylon. And I think that must be like, this is my personal imagination. When they were walking, I assume they walked. They were walking to Babylon. I think that must be the time when Daniel and his friends were talk things over. We don't know what's going to happen, but this is where we stand. Yeah, we don't know what's going to happen. We're going to be standing on the ground where we want to be faithful to God. And if we want to go further, even what make them to think that way? And I don't want to go that, that kind of all the details, but we can find some evidences where Jeremiah must be around before that destruction of Jerusalem happened. And there must be some kind of very good godly education and influence over them. And this is a kind of where we're kind of guessing based on the things that we read in the book of Jeremiah and other books. That from his youth, when he was growing up, he must have been taught the way, God's way. Although all these kings were wicked, but he must be been receiving this education in his life about his faith, grounding in his faith, being faithful, and God is still there. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense to me. Like you don't have anything to do with God, and all of a sudden you went to Babylon as a captive, and all of a sudden you are faithful to God. I don't think that's really possible. So I always try to think that Daniel and his friends, and I hope there was more people like them, must have been in a system or in a family or in a community where they were grown up that way, so that their faith has been kind of blossomed in a situation where everyone think that is not really possible. I don't know, that's just my thought, uh based on reading. And it kind of the next several chapters, he talks about the struggles that they had. Although it wasn't, I don't think that was a 3-year period, but even after they finished, after they were appointed as a high government official, they still had to go through some struggles. And I think that's, looking in that, there must be, I think that this would be one of the examples how their life in Babylon was like, to be faithful to God.
Well, I think so Ezekiel would have been right before this, right? And some of his prophecies, he was talking about that there would be a remnant people at the end that God would save when they would be eventually captured, that he would keep some people. Wow, I'm not sure what verses those would be. Is that Ezekiel that comes from? I was just
To me,
reading.
it sounds like Jeremiah. I don't know if
It
I'm
might
wrong.
have been, but it doesn't really matter probably which particular prophecy this is, but God said, you know, certain people are going to be killed and certain people are going to be put out and some people are going to be captured, and I'm going to keep a certain remnant people for my use. And we've seen this in other cities where God destroyed. He checked to see how many people were faithful to him. It's obvious that before Daniel and his friends were captured here, even though the state of Israel had declined so far that God was willing to enact these punishments, these extreme measures, there were still people that must have had a very close walk with what God had intended to come out of, you know, and to have that kind of character. It wasn't like everybody had sunk to the lows that Israel had done.
I remember, like, even Book of Isaiah, it talks about those specific word remnant. Although you will receive all this, we're going through Book of Isaiah right now. It specifically mentions about that there will be a remnant of people, and if
That may be the text that I was thinking.
yeah, and there were actually remnant people in area of Jerusalem. If we were to read book of Ezra and Nehemiah, because what we see here is, so let me just stretch out and expand this picture of what was happening. If we read the minor prophet books, those short books in the Old Testament, you will see that one of the reasons why northern kingdom of Israel and southern kingdom of Judah was punished was they did not really take care of the vulnerable people, fatherless, orphans, poor people. They did not stand for justice. They oppressed them. One of a good example is Ahab's story. Remember, like Ahab, King Ahab, one of the most famous king, Ahab, unfortunately, one of the most wicked king, we should say. And he wanted to take a vineyard right next to his palace, Naboth's palace in the vineyard. And for Israelites, what the very strong conviction that and the teaching the Israelites had was the land belongs to God. It doesn't belong to anyone. So, and every clan or family received a property, and that inheritance goes along with their family line. If you get more by buying or somebody loan, borrow money they couldn't pay back, so you take their land, every 50 year, we call Jubilee, everything should go back and everyone can reset and restart. That's the system that they are. But unfortunately, it didn't really happen that way. And Israelites were really oppressing people towards those vulnerable people. When Babylonian took the captives, as you see here, in verse 3, so King Ashpenaz bring some children of Israel, some of the king's descendants, some of the nobles, so that we can see kind of who they took.
Mm-hmm.
So they are the people, the children of the nobles, like government officials or royal family. They took those kind of higher ranking people as captives, but they did not take just regular citizens there,
right,
who have been oppressed. So if you read book of Jeremiah, you can see the stories where those people who are left over, there's some struggles there as well. If you see the book of Nehemiah and Ezra, when Nehemiah, Ezra, when they went back to Jerusalem with people from Babylon, the captives, there were local people who lived there, who have been there for a long time. And there's some tensions between the Jews who were there, maybe have some memories because it's been like 70 years. They were like, yeah, you guys were so, not really fair. You always wanted to be rich. We're always poor. And now you guys are coming back and say you want to build a city. And do you want to create a system that it used to be? Like there's a kind of that kind of tension there. So like there are definitely some remnant people there, but I think when we're talking about remnant here is that spiritual sense where people who have been faithful even in a time where
Right.
everyone was not really faithful to God.
Right.
The remnant people are the people who are, keeping the commandments of God and try to practice that in their life. I think that's the remnant that is referring to me personally.
Mhm.
But definitely, like there's so many things going on in this story, and I think we should see the two ways. There are remnant people in Babylon where, like Daniel and his friends, being faithful. There must be a small number of remnants in Jerusalem who are not taken as a captives, but there were some faithful people there too. If you remember when Jeremiah was there, because Jeremiah was the prophet for the people who left over in Jerusalem, and he was trying to convey this message there, like, don't go to Egypt, stay here, because this is the land. And there were people who tried to go to Egypt, ignoring Jeremiah, and eventually they took them. But there were people who did not, listen to them and try to be faithful to what Jeremiah wanted to say. But there are always that small number of remnant people there. I don't know. It was the answer that you were looking for, but anything else that came up with you? We read verse 17, right?
Yes.
The
I
only
like that verse a lot, personally.
The only comment I have is they got fat on vegetables and water.
Yeah. And one thing that we know is this:
Doesn't say that here.
in the system of Babylon, of course, in many cases where meat are, meats are something that they use to offer to their gods.
This is close.
So like the meats that they have must have been offered to the idols, and they did not want to, because then we can see this word right here, defile, is very spiritual sense where Israelites, they have been, they know what's a clean animal, unclean animal, and it could be what kind of meat that they were served, or it could be the meats that they were offered to the idol gods and there. But to me, it's that faithfulness. I think that, it's not like, I don't want to conclude the story as like Daniel and his friends were so smart because of the menu that they had. I want to say that they were blessed is because of their faithfulness to God, and the wisdom came from God. So I don't know. That's how I see it.
Yeah.
Let's move on. I was gonna ask Laverne to read, but she disappeared. Are you
What
there?
happened? I got a call and then it
Okay.
took me out.
All right. That's okay. Then I'm going to read the rest of the verses here. At the end of the days, when the king had said that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. Then the king interviewed them, among them all, not among them all, None was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore, they served before the king. And in all matters of wisdom and understanding about which the king examined them, he found them 10 times better than all the musicians, astrologers who were in all his realm. Thus Daniel continued until the first year of Cyrus. First year of Cyrus. And we all know Cyrus is not the king of Babylon. He's the king of Persia. So that's why a lot of people think that Daniel must have written this book when he was in very like late years when he was in Persia because of this verse. But anyways, anything came up to you? I always wondered that word 10 times better. What does that really mean? 10 times better. A plus 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 plus. Actually, this is why I named my son Nathan. His Korean name is Hyunmyeong. I got that idea from this part here, where
Cool.
in verse 17 actually, the wisdom, like his Korean name Hyunmyeong means wise and bright. That's the meaning of his Korean name. And his brother's name, I took Korean words called Chongmyeong, meaning smart. So the first one's name is wise. Second one's name means smart. So hopefully they can work together, be wise and smart.
It's not the same.
It's a good plan.
Because you need to be wise. I mean, just being smart doesn't mean that you are wise.
Correct.
And then vice versa. Being wise doesn't mean that you are smart. So I want both of them have both. The other thing that I wanted to point out is, and kind of going back to verse 17, is that Daniel had this gift. You see that? Daniel received that gift.
Mhm.
That he has this gift of understanding in all visions and dreams. Kind of gives us this hint what's coming after this chapter. Any thoughts based on what we read today, the first chapter of the Book of Daniel?
Well, like Mark said before, you want to know what happened in the 3 years. Well, this is kind of the culmination of the 3 years. It comes to the end of the 3 years. But then when you start into chapter 2, it goes back again. Because it goes into King Nebuchadnezzar's second year of reign. It's backtracking. It's not a chronological order.
Mm.
And the Book of Daniel itself, it looks like chronological order, but actually, if you kind of look very close into this, it's actually not. I mean, in the bigger picture, like Babylon, Persia, in the same way, but in a kind of literal kind of genre of the writing, the introduction gave us this boom, and then you have like small things, details were given that way. People are kind of explaining, Daniel, he was in the University of Babylon learning all this, because Babylon is known for many different kind of famous, like how do you call it, astrology, like studying the stars and the sky. They were known for that. Studying the numbers, the mathematics, what do you call it? Like, starting with 6, like they have this system of 6, like clock, for example, the 60 minutes, the 360 degrees, all these numbers relating to this 6 is from them. That's why it's interesting when it comes to the numbers of man in the book of Revelation as 666. That kind of goes back to Babylonian kind of tradition. They must have studied their language, must have been studying their gods, theology, and cultures. And this is just my guess that Daniel tried to be successful in his career in that very competitive and politically sensitive palace like that for a long time. He must have been gifted and inspired in many, many different ways. Otherwise, how could that be?
Right.
How could that be? So, yeah, that's one of the things. The other thing that I have is the choice that he made. And I think this chapter is one word that I can came. I mean, there are many things that we can learn, but one of them is definitely choice. He was determined, and Daniel purpose in his heart. And I mean, we're living here in this country where freedom is everywhere, where you can make that choice for yourself. But I don't know about you, but I hear a lot of this. I cannot really control myself. I have to do this. I want, I cannot, like, there's nothing I can do about it, so I have to do this. And, I always think about it and sometimes share this chapter, like, don't you think that God gave us choice to make? And when we make the right choice, being faithful, and he always bless his faithful people. So that's one thing that always stuck in my mind whenever I read this chapter.
Very good.
Any questions or any comments?
I was thinking back, they going back to taking the vessels
Mm-hmm.
and putting them in his own house of his God, is the Israelites were not allowed to touch the Ark of the Covenant,
Yep.
or they would die. So how were they able to acquire these vessels and not die? Is it because they were not an Israelite and it didn't pertain to them? Or anyway, it just crossed my mind.
Very, very good point. One of the things that this would be just my personal opinion into that. People, like, we know stories where, when they put this ark on the wagon or something and then it was moving, so this guy tried to hold it and touch it and died, and we know that story. Like, all the articles in the temple are holy, that you shouldn't be, only the priest have access to it. I think all these things are there, all those rules were there because of the glory of God was dwelling with them. And God wanted to teach them about the plan of salvation through the service, through this, it's kind of, to me, whenever we talked about it for our baptismal prep, sanctuary was God's kind of PowerPoint, his visual aid kit to teach Israelites about the plan of salvation. And they need to learn about some important lessons about, his holy. Like, why would God want, people not to walk into the sanctuary by themselves? It's because he wanted to teach them that sin and his holiness cannot really stay together. That's the kind of main purpose of that. So, like, when God's presence was there, when his glory were there, when people are trying to, break it intentionally, there was a consequence, like someone who touched and died and stuff like that. when Babylon were marching to Jerusalem, I don't think that his glory was around there. In book of Ezekiel, for example, God's glory was moving out, like leaving from the city. You see that? His
Yeah.
temple, all I mean, even in the book of Ezekiel, we can find the record where if you go to the field, I mean, if you go into the temple, that area in the space right in front of it, you see this priest. I'm not talking about just lay people, priest looking towards the east, and they're worshiping the sun. If you there, and God said he said, this is just disgusting. Don't bring me any sacrifice. I don't want your worship anymore. And turn back. We see record like that a lot in the book of prophets. So to me, like, because of their way to treat their own brothers and sisters, excuse me, because of the way that they worship idols, because of their wicked ways, because of their wicked kings, eventually, although Solomon built this great temple, beautiful temple, but his glory wasn't there. So, and that's why it must have been a big theological and faith struggle for many Israelites to figure out. We thought God was with us. We thought we're living in the city of God. But why this destruction happens? And to me is like that. Like when Babylonian came, it was just too late. God wasn't there. There's no hedge around protection over there. And if God's presence is not there, those articles are just metal, just objects. There's nothing holy about it.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense.
But if we go back, I mean, we're gonna eventually go there in Daniel chapter 5, I believe, when Belshazzar, the last king, who were having a party. Remember that story? And he wanted to have those articles, bring it to him, and he wanted to use that cup to drink. And now that is very intentional from his part to try to show that he doesn't really care, or he's defying God's presence there, right there. Because King Nebuchadnezzar, I think he eventually accepted God because of his experiences. That must be his grandfather. He must have known that, and now he's intentionally defying God, and that that cup became the symbol that he is kind of crossing that line where he's totally going against God, which has been used a lot in the book of Revelation, where you're drinking the cup of wrath. And there's no other places that we can find it except the book of Daniel, where he was having party and he was intentionally wanting to bring those articles and vessels, and he took that and he drank with it. And that's the language that repeat over and over in the book of Revelation, where to me is like, you are very, he was very intentional. It was very intentional to defy God, and God responded that way. And Revelation said, don't do that. Don't go there. Don't be like, and that's why he said, come out of Babylon, repeatedly saying that. Okay, I mean, I know we spent a little more than an hour. I don't want to take too much time because we all need rest after seeing a lot of news today. My phone is ringing with all these notifications. I was like, I don't want to see this. I don't want to see this. But hopefully, we pray for peace. We pray for our leaders, our country, and also at the same time, we need to play our role as citizens, as good citizens of this country. And like Daniel and his friends, we stand firmly with faith so that people around us should be able to see God, not us, but see God and His glory for our presence. Um, anything we want to add? Good. Okay. Why don't we bow our, but by the way, for those who are watching from YouTube and Facebook, especially those of you who watched Facebook, I'm sorry, I changed some settings on my computer, so from the beginning you didn't hear audio really well. Later I saw the comments, so I changed it. You should have been able to hear well. For those who joined with us through YouTube, thanks for joining with us. And this is not just limited number of people. You can join with us and we can have discussion. We can read this book together, like Mark and Stu and Val share with us today. What a perfect time for us to go into this book, where we may see things like we're losing, like when Daniel saw Jerusalem destroyed. But eventually, at the end of this chapter, we see that God is victorious through Daniel. So that's what we want to see. We want to see and we want to witness God's victory in our lives, like Daniel. So please join with us next time. That will be really, really wonderful. We're going to go into very, very important chapter, Daniel chapter 2, that dream that we will see. Today, Mark, can you close us with prayer?
Sure. Oh, Father in heaven, thank you so much again for your word that we have the opportunity to study together, read through, talk about. Please direct our hearts and our minds. Help us to be as Daniel was and determine in our hearts to follow you through all things so that you can shine in our lives, so that you can help us to be a witness for your way and not man's way. Be with the people of this country tonight, and be with the unrest, and allow us, Lord, to step aside and witness you working through people's lives. Give us hands and feet that we can serve you through all circumstances. Touch our hearts, give us guidance, give us love for one another during all of the unrest that we are witnessing. Thank you, Lord, for your promises and for the knowledge and the wisdom to know that you are God, and in the end, we are able to be with you and to be restored as your people. Thank you, Lord. We pray in your name. Amen.
Amen. Well, thanks so much. Let me